Sidetrack, Episode 43, A Monument of Heresy, Part 1. Welcome back to A2Z History Presents The History of the Papacy. We are now a proud member of the Agora podcast network. In a previous episode, I made mention that Nestorius's bust would be on the Mount Rushmore of heretics. Paul suggested an episode on the other figures that would be on that Mount Rushmore of heresy. Just so we're on the same page here, Mount Rushmore is a large mountain cliff in the South Dakota area of the United States of America. On the face of the cliff, an artist carved out the busts of 4 presidents of the United States. Each of the presidents are about 18 meters or 60 feet high. The presidents' faces are in no particular order chronologically, and people argue endlessly over whether some president or not deserved to be up there. In this episode, I'm carving a virtual Mount Rushmore of heretics from the history of early Christianity. I'm going to attempt to cherry-pick through Christian history the theologians, leaders, and thinkers whose ideas fell somewhere outside of the mainstream or were not accepted as mainstream for one reason or another. This is just my list. You will have your own list that has some of the same names and a few different ones. I would love to hear who is on your list. Please share your ideas, and I will include them in a follow-up episode. I've picked 7 historical heretics to include on my list. I picked 7 because 7 seemed to be a good Christian number, very heavily used in the Apocalypse of John, so why not? I tried to pick people whose ideas and theologies really tested the mainstream, challenged the mainstream, and even in a roundabout way influenced the mainstream. I've decided to use the term heretic loosely. Some of these people are considered heretics, some are not. Some influenced movements that became heretical. What I'm trying to get at is the outsider element, the other, the heterodox. By looking at the heterodox, we can learn more about the Orthodox, small o, who we focus in on more often. The historical outsiders we will carve on the mountain today are Simon Magus, Marcion, and Paul of Samosata. You'll have to listen to part 2 to find out the rest. I decided to start right at the beginning. If you are going to make a list of the greatest heretics, you have to start with the guy who's referred to as the father of all heresies. In the book of Acts, Simon Magus is important because he is the earliest example of a person who was outside of the mainstream. In the book of Acts, Simon was a Samaritan who converted to Christianity very early in the apostolic era, while Peter was still in Palestine. All it says is that Simon became a Christian and then offered Peter money to become an apostle, therefore gaining apostolic power. Simon perceived that the power of Peter and the apostles as a type of magic, and he wanted to add that power to his magical bag of tricks. Peter rebuked Simon, told him not to do that again, and sent him packing. That was the birth of simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices and anything of spiritual nature or relation. The heresies of Simon don't stop there, though. He is also credited with the innovation of Gnosticism. A later tradition based on the Clementine literature says that Simon Magus went to Rome, where he founded his own sect and was elevated to the rank of a god. Simon taught there was some type of secret knowledge and that he had it. In the end, Simon Magus was literally brought down by both Peter and Paul. The emperor called a sort of a showdown between the team of Peter and Paul versus Simon, right in the middle of the Roman Forum. Simon Magus did a spell and started to fly around the Forum. Everyone was impressed. But then Peter and Paul kneeled and prayed together. Simon Magus face-planted into the plaza and later died. The obvious question that comes up with Simon Magus is, how much of this story is historical and what is completely made up? I don't think there is any reason to discount the Book of Acts narrative. Trying to buy the power that the apostles are told to have seems like a natural thing a person of less than ideal scruples would try to do. Simon was told, no, that's not how this whole thing works, and that was that. As far as the later descriptions of Simon Magus, these are more than likely a composite of a few different people mixed with some hyperbole to make a larger point. The later traditions paint Simon Magus as the mega-villain to Peter and Paul in Rome. He mirrors them in deciding to go to Rome, but Simon makes all the wrong choices. Simon also serves to create a fountainhead of Gnosticism, a belief system that was building a following during the end of the 1st and 2nd century. Simon Magus is named the father of all heresies, so if he doesn't make the list, who would? The next major heretic I'd like to discuss is Marcion of Sinope, Anatolia. Marcion of Sinope lived in the 2nd or 3rd generation of Christians after the Apostolic era. Marcion was born in the late 1st century and lived during the early to mid-2nd century. Most of the major Christian scriptures were published by this time, and an early orthodoxy and hierarchical structures were forming. Marcion was the son of a bishop in Sinope and was probably of Greek extraction. Legend has it that Marcion was excommunicated by his own dad for various misdeeds with young ladies, not becoming of a bishop's son, if you know what I mean. It sounds like Dad was a bit harsh, and Marcion really tried to get back into his father's good graces, but with no luck. Marcion decided to take his chances in Rome and move to the imperial city. The local Christians heard of Marcion's excommunication and wouldn't overturn the local decision of Sinope's synod. After that, Marcion decided to go it alone. It is also possible that this whole story was concocted to make Marcion look bad. None of the early writers say anything about Marcion being anything but a completely ascetic and pious man. It's even highly likely that Marcion was a bishop already by the time he made it to Rome. Based on how well he knew the scriptures and was able to discuss them, the question one could ask is how Marcion was already a bishop. Remember, ecclesiastical hierarchy was by no means regularized by this early point. It is very possible that Marcion was an assistant bishop, if you will, of his father, learning the ropes and so forth for when his father retired. Next question, what the heck was he doing in Rome? One possibility is that Marcion was in Rome on matters regarding his family's business concerns. He started preaching his unorthodox message, got a following, and went from there. Another possibility is the story that his father kicked him out of Sinope, and Marcion decided to try his luck in Rome. Why not? It is even possible that Marcion was sent to Rome for a mixture of financial and ecclesiastical opportunities. One way or the other, Marcion hit the town and made a big name for himself. Marcion earns his place on the mountain because his theology made sense in some regards and was completely off the wall in others. The Marcionite theology is commonly lumped into Gnosticism because it used some of the same vocabulary and drew some of the same conclusions. Marcion taught that Christianity needed to completely write off all of the Jewish aspects of the religion. Christians didn't need any of the Old Testament whatsoever. It was all irrelevant to a Christian. Marcion had a major problem with the Old Testament. You could say that, a major problem. He cannot make sense of how the loving God and Jesus portrayed in the Gospels could line up with the God of the Old Testament, who would wipe out whole villages, do things to people just to mess with them, Levitical laws that really didn't make sense to Gentiles and all that. The Christians were the new covenant of Israel, so why worry about the rest of the old covenant? Well, he had to be a little concerned with the rest. Marcion had to explain how the world came into existence. Marcion explained that a lesser deity, a demiurge, created the world and was the God of the Old Testament. That sort of talk is very Gnostic, except Marcion didn't take that conclusion into a completely Gnostic direction. The demiurge did some good things like create the world, but he did some bad things as well. As opposed to certain types of Gnosticism or Manichaeism, Marcion didn't portray the demiurge as the opposite of the ultimate transcendent God, the God of the New Testament and Jesus. The demiurge was a real god, but he just wasn't up to the standard of the top god. The demiurge was the one who inspired the Old Testament prophets, and he was the god of the Jewish people. The demiurge served his purpose, now he was past his prime. As far as texts go, Marcion used a redacted version of the Gospel according to Luke with pieces removed that tipped their hat to the Old Testament. He also used a number of Paul's writings in his canon. Marcionism didn't begin as a Gnostic movement, and it generally complied with proto-Orthodox practice. But as the decades rolled on, Marcionites drifted more and more into a Gnostic direction. Marcion and his sect were a real thorn in the side of mainstream Christians in the early days. He asked the questions a lot of Gentile converts must have been asking about the Old Testament. He also took the New Covenant ideas to its extremes. Marcion tried to strip all the Jewishness and Old Testament out of Christianity and turn it into a completely Gentile religion. He had texts and precedents laid out, but his theology had some holes in it that stopped it from being accepted by the mainstream. Marcionism was a popular movement and took a great deal of polemical ink to refute it. Gnosticism was a major concern for the Proto-Orthodox in the 100s and 200s AD, but Gnosticism took a different track from mainstream Christianity. The conflicts within mainstream Christianity would change in their nature in the upcoming decades. We fast forward almost a century to get to our next name, Paul of Samosata. In the 100 or so years between Marcion and Paul of Samosata, the church was not conflict-free. Certain conflicts were winding down and others were just getting started. Paul of Samosata is an end cap to one type of theological debate and the beginning of another. Paul of Samosata was the bishop of Antioch in the middle part of the 200s AD. Paul made the list because he is the nexus of so many different stories of Christian and secular history. It's worth a minute or two of our time to talk about Antioch. The roots of Christianity in Antioch run just about as deep as any other place in the world, really rivaling Jerusalem. The city of Antioch was the third city of the Roman Empire after Roman Alexandria. It was an important cultural and commercial center, but importantly for Christianity, it was the first really big city the new religion took root in. It was quite close to Jerusalem and all the action of the earliest days of Christianity. As a matter of fact, Antioch was the first place where the followers of Jesus were called Christians, not Galileans or Nazarenes as they were in other places at that time. Antioch had a specific culture and language, as well as an independent streak. The bishopric of Antioch was a Petrine see, meaning it was founded by Peter the Apostle way before he ever went to Rome. Antioch had a very strong apostolic foundation and its own way of doing things. Well before the time of Paul of Samosata, theologies were floating around that Jesus was a man who was in some way adopted by God. Alternatively, the Godhead was just one thing that showed itself in different ways, but were all in the end the exact same thing. God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus were just masks of the unknowable Godhead. As with all other Christian theologies, this overarching belief could be broken down into an almost infinite number of subgroups. The time frame of the middle of the 200s is important for Paul's story. This was the time of the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire broke up into 3 units. The Middle East was under the control of the Palmyrines. This group of rulers had their own language and culture beyond the Hellenistic culture that permeated the area. Paul of Samosata was accused of all sorts of misdeeds. For one, Paul was said to have not used the title Bishop of Antioch and only used a secular government title. Being a bishop and holding a secular office at the same time was highly frowned upon. Paul was also accused of selling religious sacraments, another misdeed that went way back. Lastly, Paul's critics said that he kept a cadre of women in very close company called sub-introductae. We don't know the exact type of relationship Paul and these women had, but it was definitely too close for comfort for many. So Paul had some major pastoral problems here as well. He was also highly criticized for his innovation of the term homoousios. Homoousios was an incredibly controversial word. People like Dionysius, Patriarch of Alexandria, couldn't believe a term from Greek philosophy was getting thrown into the mix on how the various members of the Trinity were related. The term homoousios had absolutely no basis in biblical scripture. It's ironic that a term that was verboten in the mid-200s would be the linchpin of the First Ecumenical Council a few short decades later. The specter of Paul was all over the Council of Nicaea in 325. Canon 19 specifically dealt with Paul's sect. More importantly, the Arian subordinationists were likely influenced by Paul's ideas. Paul is considered a heretic, no question, but one of his students, Lucian of Antioch, is a saint of the church. 2 of Lucian's students, Eusebius of Nicomedia and Arius of Alexandria, are not considered saints. Paul of Samosata set up the actual school of Antioch that would eventually lead to Diodor of Tarsus, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and even Nestorius. All of these church leaders didn't hold the same views as Paul, and there isn't really a continuity of thought with all these men going back to Paul. That being said, they were all working in the Syriac tradition, which was often at times at odds with the Latin and Hellenistic traditions. For all these reasons and more, you can see why Paul of Samosata kept the Orthodox up at night. Paul of Samosata may have irked the Greeks and the Romans because he pushed forward the native Syriac tradition. That got under the skin of the Christians of a more Hellenistic bent because the Syriac tradition was in a way a competitor to their theological and cultural traditions in the Middle East. The cultural conflict between the Greco-Romans and the Syrians bore long fruit. Beside the long line of Syriac theologians and hierarchs we mentioned, there was also a line of centers of learning from Antioch to Edessa, Nisibis, and Gundashapur, all of these outside of the traditional Latin Hellenistic cultural sphere. Paul of Samosata held ideas that were unorthodox and also supported an enemy of Rome, along with pushing an alternative cultural agenda. When the Emperor Aurelian restored the world, so to speak, he sided with the mainstream of Christianity over Paul of Samosata. He didn't really care about the whole issue, he just wanted the whole thing smoothed over. And even after all of this, Paul of Samosata really cast a long shadow over the history of Christianity. We're going to leave off today with Paul of Samosata. Don't worry, we have 4 more people to discuss, but I'll leave you guessing who will round out the list, so tune in next time or log in or whatever you kids do these days to find out. Another way to support the show, and we got one more way, and that's iTunes reviews. If you leave an iTunes review, it's greatly appreciated, and if you email me, I will send you the bonus track as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.